So we're carrying on with this reading called Learning to Speak. And as I said, this is a text that I wrote that's going to be published forthcoming at the end of the year. But what I'm doing is I'm just giving you a bit of reflection, or we're sort of taking a step back and looking at the architectural profession. And these gives you they give you lenses to understand the architectural profession through. And so we're jumping between, you know, I raise a point and then we'll read a quote. And so I'm quoting many people in the profession. So, you know, in our first lecture, we looked at the AP, the Architects Against Apartheid, writing at the end of the 80s. And it gave us a good sense of what the state of the profession was like in those last years of apartheid. How you had a small numbers of people that were completely against the status quo, a large amount of people that were not willing to really change anything, and then they ended that piece by really being critical of how architects after '94 will just simply go to where the new work is. So then we moved on and we looked at how that kind of architectural politics carries on today. You know, how in the 80s there was this silence against explicitly critiquing the status quo, and how architecture was completely enmeshed in that in the 80s, although would never speak against it. In the 90s, that status quo changed somewhat with the whole multicultural Mandela project, and architecture was fully engaged with that. And then we looked at how in 2015 and 2016, the country was completely immersed in the student and worker protest across the whole country, including inside some of the architecture schools. But again, the architectural profession was silent on that. And then we looked at COVID and Black Lives Matter and all of these things, and we could pick up a pattern of the issues which the architectural discipline is comfortable engaging with, and those which it is not comfortable engages with and remains completely silent about. And we picked up the pattern that a pattern emerged, that those issues which show that history is not in the past, but history is the present, and how we are still living with many unaddressed, unresolved issues and challenges in the present and not in the past. And those things which implicate apartheid and colonialism and inequalities and frustrations and all kinds of things in the present, the pattern emerged that those are the things which architecture tends to be very silent about. Now, do any of you have any idea why that is the way it is? Because you had no questions last week. Do any of you want to hazard a guess of why you think that is so? No one?
Morning, Tariq.
Morning.
How are you?
Yes. Hi.
I think maybe it could be because people don't really know their history, so they repeat it. Could that be one of the factors?
Yeah. So it's a kind of a innocent ignorance, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, that would be a very positive. That would be a positive take on it, to say that people wish well, but they just don't know any better. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what
Okay.
I think it is. Yeah.
Okay. That's a very generous reading. Anyone else got any suggestions?
Morning.
Morning.
I think personally is that people probably like somewhat do know their history, albeit it's not at a very intense or exact rate, but they know exactly what the history is. It's just that a lot of people aren't catalysts for change because it's very comfortable staying where you are and knowing the life that you know. So changing something that already works doesn't really seem like something that a lot of people want to do.
Hmm. Yeah. So that's a different reading. Uh, if the status quo is something that's actually very comfortable for you, then there's no urgency on your behalf to change it, you know. And if things are not working for you, things are actually impeding you, inhibiting you, frustrating you, then you're going to tend to be the person that speaks out against it, right? So that's a different reading. Anyone else got any suggestions? Chuck says people have no reason to change, so they just continue to benefit, which was what which is what the last person said about when if one doesn't oneself experience uh, directly experience challenges and frustrations, then one has perhaps very little sense of urgency. Okay, let's. Anyone else want to jump in before we actually get to our reading? I mean, so also what you're picking there is that it's the question of, although you didn't say it explicitly, but it's the question of who are architects, right? The discipline is going to reflect the people who make up the profession. It's not a profession that came from the moon. The architectural profession is made up by architects, you know, and the concerns of the architects is what is going to be reflected in the profession. The things that the people who make up the architectural profession are not concerned with is going to be reflected, right? The things which people wish to speak about is going to be reflected in the discipline. The things that people don't wish to speak about is not going to be reflected, right? So the agents, you know, the constituency, the people who speak for architecture, who teach architecture, who practice architecture, who write architecture, are going to, the discipline is going to reflect their concerns, and it's going to reflect what they're not concerned with as well. So there's agency. That's a sort of an academic word. Agency means the people doing the talking, the people doing the acting, the people doing the writing, the voice of the profession, the character of the profession that starts to reflect all those things. Okay. So, and this brings us to the topic this brings up to this topic called transformation, right? Transformation, which you will go through your whole architectural education, even right up to, you know, postgrad, masters, and you will hardly ever hear this word. This word is hardly ever spoken about. And if you study all the publications that have been written in the last 30 years, you will hardly come across a single publication that addresses transformation. It's if it is discussed, it's discussed in a private space, and it's often treated as it's so sensitive and and people speak about it in a way like they're walking on eggshells, almost, in a way. So although it is supposedly this broad and project of the post-apartheid era, in architecture it's hardly spoken about publicly. There's hardly any research published on it. It's this seemingly this public project that the whole country is on board with, and yet in practice it's very much not like that at all. It's treated in a way that is very unlike. Now, one of the things that people often say is that when they speak about transformation is this idea that transformation is moving at a slow rate. This is what everyone says. So if you ask anyone, any academic or any person in any of our official bodies, regulatory, SACAP or South African Council or the South African Institute of Architects, SAIA, or an academic, or whoever you ask, this is generally the answer you'll get. Transformation is moving at a slow rate, which means there's lots of presumptions in this statement. One is the presumption that it's moving. That's already a presumption that you think things are moving. And there's a presumption that there's a rate, that things are just moving naturally and they're always going to be moving and presumably in the right direction. That's also a presumption. And the presumption is that it's moving and there's a rate, and the only problem is that it is slow. That's another presumption. And these things are never really studied in any detail. Who said that it's moving? And who says that there's a rate? And who said the only problem is that it is slow, right? These things are never interrogated. So we'll start looking at today this idea of transformation. Okay. So let me begin here. Yeah, in the South African context, and we'll just skip this quote in the beginning. In the South African context, given the general reticence and inertia within the mainstream of the built environment, in other words, there's a kind of a reluctance and no urgency and a kind of a silence in many respects and in many spaces. Given this, within the mainstream of the built environment and design professions, toward the post-apartheid project of transformation, and transformation generally understood here as a project of racial equity to redress the racial inequalities of apartheid colonialism, right? And we're talking about inequalities, hey? It's a plural there. That's very important. It's not inequality. The equalities are multiple and they're compounding. They exist in many ways, in many respects, in many spaces, on multiple levels, which are little appreciated. So there's a sense of a reticence and inertia towards these multiple inequalities. And this inertia is happening simultaneous with its urgency, right? So there is supposedly urgency, but yet there's like inertia and a lack of urgency at the same time. Even during the euphoria that accompanied the first democratic elections in 1994, after centuries of European colonial domination, some, keenly aware of the architectural status quo, offered a more somber diagnosis. And here I mention again the AAAP, who foresaw that architecture as a profession would adapt to the new democratic political climate and client market, the expanded client market now, only to the minimum extent that it would be opportunistically worthwhile for it to do so. So already AAP was pointing to the fact that for most people, it's just going to be business as usual, right? This sense of urgency of this post-apartheid of transformation is not really going to be reflected in the profession, but it would only take it up to the minimum extent that it would be opportunistically worthwhile for it to do so. So in other words, it's going to be business as usual for most people. They had business in the 80s and the 70s, and now they'll have business in the 90s and the noughties, right? So they were already in 1994, these guys from ARP were already seeing the writing on the wall, right? They were already seeing that we shouldn't be we shouldn't get too excited about things. Things are going to remain. A lot of things are just going to remain the same. A lot of things are just going to remain business as usual for most people in the discipline. So they were citing this the market, the clientele, the business aspect of it, and that the discipline at large will not really take up this invitation for transformation. Okay. So they were already seeing that happening in the 90s, right? They were already sounding the alarm bells back then, and I don't think anyone was really listening. And then we continue. So that's already one thing that's countering, this idea of transformation moving at a slow rate. Already in 1994, ARP was saying it's not going to be a slow rate. There are going to be forces for transformation and counter forces against it. So they are identifying a counter force, which is different to this narrative of a slow rate, right? This is not about a slow rate, what ARP is pointing out. They're actually identifying forces and patterns that are actually regressive patterns. So let's read on. In the wake of the formal demise of apartheid, the Council for the Built Environment, the CBE, was established in 2001 as a government umbrella body attached to the Department of Public Works. So this is a government body, right, connected to national government that is attached to the Department of Public Works. This body was created. And what is its purpose? The CBE was mandated to provide leadership on transformation within the built environment professions and the sector at large, and is responsible more generally for advising the professional councils of the built environment professions on the needs of state, right? So this council was created by national government to oversee the built environment professions and to advise them and to provide leadership for them, right? Because they saw the need to do that. And there are basically three points that I want to point out what this council tries to do. The first point is to lead on the imperative for a strong focus on registration numbers and an urgent priority to drastically increase the representation. A strong focus on registration numbers and an urgent priority to drastically increase the representation of previously disadvantaged groups among the profession, right? So this is one of the aims of the CBE, is to provide leadership on transformation, meaning that the people who register in our discipline as architects must increase and must be more reflective of the society that we live in, right? which is sort of static obvious in a way. The second goal, that the profession must aid the developmental objectives of the country. And the third is that there must be a specific focus on the entire skills pipeline. So these are the three main aims of the CBE. To have the discipline that is more reflective of its society, to have a profession that is serving the developmental objectives of the country, and a focus on the entire skills pipeline. So in other words, it means you're not just looking at who graduates in your final year of, your architectural degree and then making sure that they register as an architect, but you're going back to the school system, what they are exposed to at school, that they graduate with the right skills, that they get accepted into university, that there's support through the university, that people don't drop out for whatever reason, that they do go through to the end, that they do graduate, and then when they do graduate, that they then register and find employment, and etc., etc. That's what they mean by the entire skills pipeline, right? So this is the CBE's idea of transformation, right? It's representational transformation, having, that you actually have a black people in the profession, developmental objectives of the country, and a skills pipeline. Okay. So that's what the CBE is interested in. Now, one of the things that it points out, because the CBE wants to monitor if transformation is actually happening, right? They want to be able to measure if there's any change. So let's read here. The above rubrics of transformation has relied on the quantitative monitoring of race as an indicator of redress in the post-apartheid period, right? So the CBE is monitoring racial classifications in order to see if there is any change in racial terms. And so what the CBE and this monitoring mechanism has done is it has revealed the alarming, in racial terms, slow rate of transformation as it is often uncritically described within the architectural profession. In 2009, the proportion of registered professional architects in South Africa from previously disadvantaged communities stood as low as 16%, right? So in 2009, about 16% of architects were black, right? The remaining 84% classified as white. So put in other words, out of every 1 in 10 architects, about 1.5 of them would be black. The other 8.5 would be white. Okay. Although, is there a question? So it's a ship in or a ship out scenario, and because architecture is to some sense an elitist profession, could it be that even the black people enter the profession aspire to be elite and part of the club? Hence, there is no rush, just like when people make it in life and go back to the townships to show off their cars at the car wash every weekend without trying to uplift those communities. If you look at the demographic that studies architecture to a certain level, it is the middle class within the black communities. The fees you pay to study architecture versus accounting and teaching. Architecture has always been an elite profession, okay? It's very expensive profession to study, very expensive profession to build. It's always been elite. It's always been serving an elite. We were at the point that in 2009, about 1.5 out of every 10 architects were black, although the country, in the country that of the whole, they constitute 92% of the population, right? So to put that in other words, 9 out of 10 people in the country is black, but let's say 1 out of every 10 in architecture is black, right? So it's the exact inversion of each other, right? The architectural profession is the exact inversion of its society. Almost a decade later, the figures confirmed a pattern of a much halted progression, where by 2016, there was an even slight regression in the figure at 15%, right? So this is not a slow rate. This is a a rate that isn't moving. In fact, it's even going slightly backwards, from 16% in 2009 to 15% in 2016. Right? It's staying the same, but it's even a marginal regression. Okay. So if it is really this urgency, then what's going on here, right? Because the reality is not reflecting this idea of urgency. Clearly, there's something wrong scenario here in the practice of this idea of transformation. There's something things that are happening that are not advancing this project that is supposedly our project. With virtually no change in the demographic makeup of professional architects, the racial structure of the South African architectural profession resembles that of the UK, where fewer than 1 in 10 architects are Black, Asian, or minority ethnic, right? So the ratios are almost the same as the UK, right? We have about 1.5 out of 10 that are Black. In the UK, you have about just under 1 in 10 that's Black, right? So the profession, the architectural profession in South Africa looks a lot like the architectural profession in the UK when you compare the ratios. And in the United States, 1.5% of architects were African American in 2008, although comprising 12 to 13% of the population. Okay, so the ratios in these Western countries are very similar to the South African scenario. However, South Africa's location in Africa, rather than in Europe or North America, should make the similarities between them still the more alarming, right? So in other words, the architectural profession in South Africa looks like the architectural profession in the UK and looks very similar to the architectural profession in the United States. However, South Africa is in Africa, right? It's in Africa. And yet it resembles the Euro-American context. And so the comparison is an alarming comparison. It's all of this should precipitate crisis-level responses, right? We should all be talking about the level of crisis we are in. That a country that is 95% Black, or 90% or so Black African, actually looks more like the United Kingdom and the United States in terms of what the architecture profession looks like, right? So in fact, we should all be talking about the kind of level of crisis that we are in. Although in the mainstream, like other westernized contexts, it has not. It has not precipitated a crisis level response. So we are in the midst of a crisis where the profession is the inversion of its society, but it's not treated like a crisis. So what's going on then, right? It should precipitate crisis level responses, but in the mainstream it has not. The wide gap between the premises, goals, and sense of urgency for transformation on the one hand, particularly at governmental level, and the persistence of normative realities in the professional and disciplinary space 2 decades after the formal demise of apartheid, on the other hand, in recent years, led representatives of government bodies and professional organizations to state ever more boldly and plainly the case for transformation, right? So at the highest level, in government especially, they are stating this need, this urgency, this crisis that we have in the built environment, and for our purposes, architecture. But despite this urgency at the highest level, the normative realities persist, the status quo remains, right? And this huge gap between the urgency at the highest governmental levels and the norms continuing in the profession has led the leadership of the profession and in our institutes to state plainly the kind of crisis that we are in. So in 2015, the president of the South African Council of the Architectural Profession said, SACAP. So the president of SACAP in 2015, he writes, let me actually find him. Because like I said, I'm quoting many people, and it would be useful for you to actually just see their own writings, because it's not my words. So Yashane Lucan was the president back then. There he is. And he's writing in the SACAP annual report. Every year, SACAP releases an annual report. So he writes in the 2015 annual report, we have a new focus and direction, transformation, right? So in 2015 now, in recognition of this crisis we are in recognition that there needs to be some urgency, there needs to be some change in the status quo. In this context, he writes, we have a new focus and direction, transformation. Transformation will be the overarching focus of all pillars of the profession. Transformation will ensure that demographic representation in the profession aligns with that of the country. Transformation is not merely seen as color by numbers, but further deals with issues of professional development and the quality of architectural education, as this impacts upon the spatial transformation of the built environment, right? Saying, yeah, we have to change direction. We have to take transformation seriously. And he's saying this is not just color by numbers. It's not just increasing numbers of, people with melanated skins, But he's saying that this is actually when we transform who makes up the profession, that is going to have many knock-on effects. It's going to impact. It's going to, transformation in representation is also going to mean transformation in education, right? So in other words, who teaches you is going to change what your education looks like, right? And not only will it transform architectural education, but it will also transform the built environment itself. So he's seeing that these transformations are going to ripple through the whole profession if they are taken seriously. So if you transform agency, who the people are that make up architecture, you're going to transform architectural education, and you transform architectural education and who the representation of it is, you're going to change the built environment, right? That's what he's saying. And then the reverse also goes, right? If you don't change who makes up the architectural profession, you won't change architectural education, and you won't really change the built environment, right? That's sort of the counter scenario we could give. So this is in 2015. SACAP is now taking a very explicit position, and a position it's taking in the context of a crisis, right? It's not taking a position because there's so much transformation. It's taking this position because there isn't, okay? It's in the context of a crisis.
Tariq?
Yes.
So just let me see if I understand this. SACAP is basically deciding in 2015 that they want to start enrolling more, is because architecture starts at a student level. So what they're saying is that they want to start enrolling more diverse students, like have a greater diversity within universities, so that the architectural, while the built environment can change, basically empowering people to make changes within their own context and cultures. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, look, he has in that bit that I quoted there, he hasn't gone into specifics there. He's making a general comment on the urgency and need for transformation. But in that in that text that he wrote in the SACAP annual report, he doesn't go into specifics there yet. Would you like me to mention some of their specifics? So SACAP recently has developed a few initiatives. The first initiative is what is known as, which is in a footnote here I'm reading, which is called, and this is recent, this is like 2018, right?
Okay.
That they have three main initiatives in 2018. I don't know if all of them still exist. Last I came across, there were problems with some of them. But this was let's say it's the intention in 2018. The first is the recognition of prior learning, right? Which it means you recognize people's prior learning and experience, etc., and they are and through that mechanism, you are able to have more transformation within the profession, right?
That makes sense.
That's one strategy. The other thing is what is called Women in Architecture South Africa. This is trying to address the lack of women in the profession as well. So the figures are not as bad as the racial disparity, but it is still a disparity as well, the gender disparity. And then the third thing is the National Architectural Student Forum, where they're actually trying to have something in SACAP that actively addresses decolonization of education calls. I'm not sure what that actually entails, but I think one of the things that it means is that you can have a student registration in SACAP as well. So that it seems as if they are trying to get students to register, so that when those students graduate, they will continue registering, and it will also increase the numbers of Black registration architects.
How's it, Tariq?
Hi there.
I wanted to find out, I mean, SACAP has the power to make all these changes. Why haven't they implemented these changes by accrediting certain universities, previously Black universities, to be able to teach architecture? Because I mean, the country is run by Black people. They've got the power to make all these changes, but they do not seem to want to make these changes. Why can't I study architecture at University of Venda, for example?
Yes, that's a good question. Look, I mean, that the universities were that's a legacy of apartheid, right, and colonialism. Is that the you had racially divided universities, and you could study certain things at some universities and other things at other universities. You know, that's one of the legacies we have. Can I read on? Otherwise,
no, you can.
Okay. So those were in 2015. SACAP was starting to identify very explicitly. Was starting to identify very explicitly that transformation needs to be addressed, and then by 2018 we start to see some very clear ideas being put forward on how to do that, right? But these are very, I mean, 2015, 2018, that was just like yesterday, right? Those things would not have had any traction yet. They would not have, we would not have seen any results from them. So let's read on. So the president of SACAP from 2015, explicitly, we can start to see a very explicit stance being taken. Now we look at SAIA, right? So SACAP is, as I mentioned, is the regulatory body. It's the body that when you graduate and you want to practice, you've got to register with them. SAIA, the South African Institute of Architects, is a voluntary body made up of architects, right? They don't regulate the profession, they promote the profession. It's architects promoting their profession. So the president of SAIA similarly at about the same time is also identifying this crisis. So I quote him, but let's find him. Sandile Ngonyama. So that's who he is. And he writes, so this is in the, SAIA also has an annual report. So he's writing in the annual report. And this is about the same time, 2013, 14, something like that. And he's writing here in his presidential introduction to the report. And he writes, the biggest criticism which continues to haunt our organization and our leadership is the lack of demographic and gender representation, right? He says this is the biggest crisis that we are dealing with. This is a major challenge facing all of us, which requires every SAIA practice and every SAIA regional office, all right? So SAIA is, has regional offices, you know, Gauteng, Western Cape, etc. Every SAIA practice and every SAIA regional office must acknowledge and also take action to correct the imbalance, right? So in other words, he's saying, don't expect me, Mr. Sandile, to do everything, right? He's saying every single architectural practice and every single regional office of SAIA must understand that they have a role to play and they must take action if we are ever going to change the situation, right? That's what he's saying. Unless we deal with this challenge head on, in other words, we don't hide away from it and never talk about it. Unless we deal with this challenge head on, history will judge us as having failed these important sectors of our societies. It's a very strange statement that he puts here. History will judge us as having failed. So you have both the from around 2015 or so, you know, there and thereabouts, you have explicit statements now coming from the president of SAIA, the president of SACAP, pointing directly to this crisis that we are in, and saying that this is the issue, right? It's not a side issue. This is our central issue, and it's not just about changing the numbers of people with a certain complexion, but that transformation is a transformation in representation, it's a transformation in education, it's a transformation in practice, it's a transformation in the built environment, it's a transformation on multiple levels, and it's a crisis on multiple levels, right? So we're starting to hear this from both SACAP and SAIA. Then let's read on. The boldest stance from the leadership the boldest stance from the leadership of the profession the boldest stance from the leadership of professional and representative bodies over recent years, however, should not be misunderstood. For it was proportional only to the sense of frustration or even failure of the transformation and developmental imperatives which were meant to define a post-apartheid era. So the post-apartheid built environment and architectural scene was supposedly about developmental imperatives and supposedly about transformation, right? That is what it claimed to be about. But that is not what the reality of it is, even decades later, right? So the boldest stance mustn't be misunderstood to mean that that this thing is now dominating all our priorities. They are saying this because it isn't. Saying this because it isn't the central question. They are saying this because it isn't tackled head on, right? That's why they're making these explicit statements, precisely because it isn't being addressed in the way that it ought to be. So the CBE, so we've heard from the head of SAIA, we've heard from the head of SACAP, and the CBE is also now also commenting on this. So the Council of the Built Environment, they write in their newsletter in 2018, it is a concern that the efforts of the built environment community into transformation initiatives in the last 2 to 3 years is not yielding the desired outcomes, one can conclude that unless there is an urgent intervention, the status quo will remain, right? So they're also saying the same thing. The status quo will remain. This, in other words, there is no slow rate. There is a status quo that needs to, if it is ever going to change, it needs explicit interventions to intentionally try to change it. Because if one doesn't intentionally try to change it, it has no, it shows no indications that it's going to change, right? And so we, you know, from Chipkin and Payne and these guys from up writing in the 80s and 90s, we've already many forces that counter any sort of transformation progress. And here we find another one of them, and this is our concluding paragraph here. Despite such acknowledgement, in other words, from the highest levels of SACAP and SAIA and government. Despite such acknowledgement and several new transformation initiatives like the 3 I mentioned from SACAP, the case is also far from straightforward. For the very factors within the architectural status quo which have haunted the transformation changes, as the SAIA president put it, right? He said transformation is haunted, that's the word he used, by many counter forces. The very factors within the architectural status quo which have haunted transformation change likewise will also likely implicate any new initiatives, right? So this is a sort of an important point to understand. There are many things that frustrate transformation in the profession. And when you have new initiatives, those same things will also frustrate initiatives, right? It's not a straightforward thing. As SAIA's executive manager of transformation explained, right? So SAIA has got a transformation portfolio that is supposedly meant to look after transformation. And she writes, the executive manager of this portfolio, she writes, the word transformation in South Africa is generally not easily embraced, and it is normally accompanied with fear of the unknown, right? So she's saying, you know, this idea of transformation is really not, it's not all that welcome. It's not really embraced so easily, right? A refocus on transformation at the same time, therefore, also produces its exact opposite, such as counter efforts to reassure existing stakeholders that the status quo is in fact not in danger of any significant change. For example, SAIA's transformation plan, as explained in its 2015 public communications, portrayed precisely such as self-awareness and self-moderation, as well as extreme sensitivity toward causing discomfort to its existing membership base. So in 2015, there are various public communications that SAIA put out. It speaks of all the key points in the proposal. So this is the proposal, the proposals they are putting forward in 2015. Benefits to all. So transformation must benefit everyone. Transformation must be about equity and equal opportunity. Transformation must be about skill and experience to be retained and enhanced. Transformation must be about improved benefits to practices, all practices. Transformation must be about values and standards that are to be attained, benefit-packed initiatives, right? All of these key points of the proposal released by SAIA in 2015 were addressed and almost entirely directed toward the existing registered architect base to appease any fears of change and, in a deep irony, to, as far as possible, assure the maintenance of the status quo, right? So what you're having, what's happening here is that it's not a slow rate of transformation, as everyone says. It's actually, there is no rate. And it has nothing to do with slowness either. What you have are shall we say, progressive forces trying to forward transformation, but you also have at exactly the same time counter forces, which frustrate it, even by the same organizations and even by the same people. So all the points that at the same time that SIRE is saying transformation is so important, at the same time, almost all the points they put forward in 2015 is addressed to the existing registered architect base to appease fears of change, right? So she's saying, the executive manager of SIRE Transformation is saying, transformation is not easily embraced, she's saying. Right? And so when she speaks, when this transformation portfolio speaks to the profession, it speaks in such a way to not to scare anybody. You know, it says transformation is going to benefit everyone. All the practices are going to benefit. There's going to be benefit-packed initiatives. You know, everyone is going to have the same opportunity. You know, skill and experience is going to be retained. You know, your practice is not going to lose out. All of these efforts are not aimed at actually transforming anything. They are actually aimed at the sensitivities of the existing membership base. All of it is about existing sensitivities, right? They are all addressed at the existing registered architect base to appease any fears of change, and in a deep irony, to as far as possible assure the maintenance of the status quo, right? So all these, virtually all the points they are putting forward here is to as far as possible assure the maintenance of the status quo. I don't know if you're catching the deep sense of irony here. You know, irony is when the actual the actual practice is the exact opposite of the intended thing. That's called irony, right? When the thing you do is the exact opposite of the thing you intend to do. That's an ironic situation. So we are looking at a deep irony here that we have amongst the highest leadership in the in the architectural profession, clear statements that is seemingly identifying a crisis and trying to address it. But at the same time that they are doing that, there's also the fear of scaring the existing membership base, which is almost entirely white, right? They don't want to scare the existing membership base, and they want to appease their fears that they're going to lose out in any way, right? So what you have are forces as well as counter forces, things working for it, things working against it, things advancing it, things frustrating it, right? Advocating for change at the same time as advocating for the status quo, right? So we can understand then that you know, and one last point that I didn't mention was also the idea that you know, there's a transformation committee. SAI also has a transformation committee that is supposed to deal with transformation. Just one little group is supposed to deal with all of this stuff, which is not possible. It needs to be taken up more broadly. So this addresses this question of a slow rate. We're not really dealing with a slow rate. We're not really dealing with a rate that is slow, but we are dealing with many forces at the same time on many levels. So yeah, so just to conclude and to wrap up, what we're looking at when we look at SACAP and their statements, when we look at SIRE and their statements, when we look at the executive manager of transformation in SIRE and we look at her statements, what we see is that it's not a slow rate. It's not just this thing that's ticking along and the only problem is that it's ticking a little bit slow, but they are at many levels. There are many forces, whether it is business, whether it is you know, a locking transformation with one single portfolio that has to change the whole discipline, like the transformation portfolio in SIRE, or whether it is, deep sensitivities about making anyone feel uncomfortable with change, as the executive manager of SIRE points out. You see at multiple levels many forces that are working for and against things at the same time. So you have a transformation project that is both advanced and crippled at the same time, right? It's moving forward and backward at the same time, which is different to this idea of a, of a slow rate. But let's just have a few questions, answer all your questions, because it's quite complex, because the crisis exists on multiple levels. So it's not one single answer. But as Lashen Lucan points out in his statement that he gave in around 2015 or so, transformation has to happen at both the representational level, at both the educational level, and as well as in physically in the built environment itself. So there are these multiple levels where we need to address the issue and see changes. Okay, my screen has stopped freezing. Okay, guys, is there any questions that you have? We can end off with some questions and then we can call it a day. So these things are things that are rarely ever spoken about, but they are, as the we see many people at the highest level saying, it cannot be left to this sort of incoherent thing that no one wants to talk about it. We actually have to address it head on as one of the central things for architecture to do, as one of our central crises that we have to address. Okay, guys, any questions?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm listening.
So my question is, does SACEP know that we're learning about these things like in school, or do they like want us to know these things that in the future as architects we can try and change these whole situations? Or
no, look, the SACEP is a regulatory body. SACEP doesn't. SACEP is not a university. SACEP has very little say on what anyone actually teaches you, and hardly anyone, like I said, hardly anyone speaks about this thing publicly. I'm, I wouldn't be surprised if I'm the only lecturer in the whole country that has ever given a lecture about something like this, right? It's not spoken about. It's treated with extreme sensitivity. It's something that people walk on eggshells around, and it's not really dealt with in the way that it ought to. There's no rigorous knowledge. There's no scholarship on it. Almost nothing. People don't really understand it. So even decades and decades later, after the formal demise of apartheid, there's still very little. I mean, the student will graduate from architecture knowing very little about the actual state of their profession and the state of their discipline. And it will be something you will have to learn if you become a member of SACEP or if you become a member of SIRE. But it certainly doesn't form a part of your education. And but I think that's a real blind spot. I don't think you are just here to learn how to design. You're entering into a discipline, into a profession. You are going to work in a practice, or maybe establish your own practice, or maybe you become an academic or a researcher, or whatever branch of the architectural discipline you go into. You need to know something about that discipline. It's not just all about design. When you work in a practice, design is only one small part of the things that you do. even though in education it's treated as if it is the main thing. There's a question from Ndamo. Who dictates what architecture students should be taught? The university itself? Yes, the university itself. Look, a SACAP regulates basic parameters. You know, every 4 years or so, SACAP will come to every architecture school and just check the basic quality of their education, right? That you are going to produce graduates who are going to be able to practice, you know, in a way that is acceptable. But the actual substance of that education is actually very flexible. You will find huge differences between different architectural schools. You know, the focus that you will find at UJ is different to the focus that you'll find in Pretoria, is different that the focus you'll find in TUT, is different to the focus you'll find in Bloemfontein, is different to the focus you'll find in UCT, right? So the leaders of these educational spaces are in many ways going to shape what kind of graduates they produce there. SACAP has a very, very minor, it oversees, but it not in the day-to-day substance of what you teach. It can't really penetrate on that level. Any other questions? Kay says, job distribution for those registered with SACAP. How does that work? I'm talking local or provincial jobs.
I know that. I know that you don't apply directly to the Department of Public Works or similar to the municipality. You know, like join the municipality and you just walk in with the CV and form, sign in. It does not work like that when it comes to provincial jobs, like top of the food chain. So apparently SACAP has a hand in that. Like, you know, previously disadvantaged blacks, so forth. There's people who were never given opportunities and so forth to get into the list of people who get chosen for those job opportunities. Considering your qualification or level of study. So what I'm hearing is they have no hand in the human resources department. I remember reading about a week ago when I was keeping up with SACAP for the past couple of years. So when they show those job opportunities, as far as public works specifically, top of the food chain.
Yeah. Okay. Look, within government, sorry, were you still speaking?
Because SACAP is like our very own traffic department. Yeah. Well, you can't go past if you don't get the license. As soon as you get it, they'll tell you, okay, be a taxi driver or be a truck driver and so forth and stuff like that. Anyway, you know what I mean.
Tariq, honestly, I do not see the benefit because if SACAP does not have the power to implement change, for example, like what Nkamva is saying, if SACAP cannot nip it in the bud in terms of who gets a government contract by the mere fact of meeting certain standards, either not BEE, but of transformation to a certain extent, what's their purpose, what's their role then if they cannot affect change at universities? If they cannot affect change in the industry itself, what's their role besides collecting membership fees? If you read their constitution, what actually governs them being set up, they've got wide powers because they're basically an arm of the government in the architectural profession, right? So if you read what the powers that they have, even in their constitution, they've got way wider reaching powers of changing what universities teach, changing the demographics of architects. They've got all those powers, but because they're not doing anything, then what's the point of a SACAP then?
Yeah, look, I'm unfortunately I can't really comment on that. I don't know what the SACAP constitution is and what powers they actually have to do the things that you're mentioning. Maybe you can read up about it and you can inform us about it.
Okay. But I don't think we've got time, but I mean, it's very broad. They've got so much power that they've been given by the Department of Public Works. And I mean, they've got power to change. They regulate what institutions teach in architecture, right? And everything that you were saying to me is like, if SACP is not having that, because even in their constitution, they're supposed to be visiting universities every year. And if you're saying they only visit every 4 years, then it's really pointless to be a member or to have a SACP in general, because they're not doing anything clearly.
Okay. Well, I mean, SACP now has the student forum. I think they came to UJ last year, if I remember correctly, and they tried to get students to register and student representation in SACP. And I encourage you to then be part of that, and then you have a voice in SACP, and you can start to raise these kinds of questions. Since they are trying to reach out to students and have this kind of student initiative.
Yeah, it's non-existent.
Yeah.
Go on their website.
No.
I've never seen anything to do with students on the SACP website. I can even go there right now.
Yeah, I think it's a very new idea that they're trying to push for, and I doubt that you will see anything at the moment. So yeah, there's lots of work to be done there. There's a few questions. Do these kind of politics occur in other disciplines as well, or is it just more prominent in architecture? The issues are in other disciplines as well. Although architecture, I don't have those. I'm trying to remember now. Architecture does lag behind some other disciplines as well, some other professions. So it is a general problem, but I think relative to some other professions like I can't remember now, finance maybe. But I read something once that was comparing them, and according to some other disciplines that have seen transformation, architecture does sometimes lag quite far behind. Another question. So what if the issue we are facing in the architectural field today is that of only the university sets its focuses to what they want to teach their students specifically, minding also that architecture schools are white dominated like the profession itself, and as a result, maybe the way of how each university teaches is actually supporting these issues? Yeah, that's actually a good point. Okay, so and we'll speak about the actual nature of our, like we're covering broad issues, and we're going to start to build our way into more detailed things, into the kinds of things you actually get taught, the kinds of things you actually, the concepts you work with in your design studios. We're going to get there. So don't think we're just going to remain on this kind of large overarching level. We're starting with the big picture, and we're going to work down to the smaller pictures. And you will see precisely how all of this stuff affects what you teach, what you learn, and what you do when you're sitting in your design studios. So the point that Ndamo makes there, that an untransformed profession also means that this has impacts on education and what you guys are taught. Absolutely, of course it does. But we haven't covered that yet, but we're going to get there. Another point from Natasha. I agree with Charles and Kamva. I think SACP is just good without collecting annual fees from the registered people. No transformation in their vision or mission. Yeah, look, SACP has been at the receiving end of a lot of criticism, and I can't speak for them. But they have in recent years received a lot of criticism. And okay, SACAP is good, is just good with collecting annual fees, but not with transformation. That's the point from Natasha. Look, I can't really, I can't provide answers for all of these things. Hey, you would almost need to have the president or representative of SACAP in front of you, and you can throw all these questions at them.
Can you organize that? Can you organize someone from SACAP to come give us a lecture on what exactly they do?
Yes, I can try to do that. I mean, they have said that is something that they want to do. So I don't know if, I don't see why they should be opposed to that. I can try, yeah. From my side, unfortunately, I don't have all the answers, but I'm sketching out some of the problems. It requires a collective effort to actually address all of those problems, as we can see, right? And the main point that I was addressing was to really bring a thread through from what we've been covering this far, which is when we look at architecture's politics and what it engages with and doesn't like to engage with. This is connected to it's connected to its representation and issues of transformation, right? That those politics are reflective of the constituency of the profession, who makes up the profession. And as some of the people we quoted were pointing out, that and some of you also pointed out that this impacts on multiple levels of the profession. The absence of transformation impacts on what you are taught in your architecture schools. It impacts on what is designed and built out there, and it impacts on many levels. So transformation is not simply about the increasing numbers of representation. That was the main point that I wanted to identify, that to pull that strand through, that when we looked at the politics of architecture, when we looked at the last years of apartheid and then the first decades of post-apartheid and all those patterns that we see, this is connected to a profession that is in many ways untransformed, right? These things are all interconnected with one another. So you can see, as we are building one readings upon readings and one level of discourse upon another, I hope you can start to see the interconnecting strands between the various points that we are raising. That is the main point I wanted to make. Unfortunately, I didn't have the answers to all of your questions. But it's a good idea that we certainly have a representative of SACAP that you can start to address questions to, and they can answer exactly what they are doing and what they're not doing, and where they are seeing successes, if there are, and where they are not, as well. So on that note, I'm going to call it a day.